Next, we're going to be talking about energy flow. Okay, how does energy move? It starts with the photosynthesis, starts with the producer, and then it moves on, but there's some more detail here. So the energy flow is essentially how much energy is necessary to each organism in a food chain or a food web, and we're going to discuss the differences between those two terms. This is one very basic food chain where you have the flower, which is a producer. The flower or the leaves is eaten by the caterpillar. That's the consumer. The caterpillar is eaten by the frog. Frog's eaten by a snake. Snake's eaten by the owl. So the energy flows. Notice the arrows. The arrows flow in the direction of the energy. Essentially, the arrow points to the more dominant species, the one that eats. So arrow follows the energy. That's something to remember when we do talk about food webs. So some of the energy is going to be available, right? When you eat meat, you get some of the energy from those biological macromolecules that are in a given piece of meat, but your body is also not efficient, so you're not going to get as much energy out as is present in that piece of food, whatever it is. So here's some terms that we're going to need to discuss. A food chain is sort of a linear sequence of organisms. It's one step in line. So you go from producer to primary consumer to secondary and so on. The trophic levels are various labels for which spot in the food chain a given organism is. So a producer is the one, well, producing the energy to start. The primary consumer is the one that eats the producer. The secondary consumer eats the primary consumer, and so on. Now, a secondary consumer, if you have an omnivore, could also be a primary consumer as well. In a way, humans are secondary consumers. They're also primary consumers. They're also tertiary consumers, depending on what they eat. So these are somewhat simple labels that don't necessarily deal with all the complexity that there is in the living world. Which brings up food webs, where a chain is only a snapshot. A food web is where you keep track of everything and all of the different organisms that do exist. And there's this sort of crisscrossing where one given animal may eat several different lower levels. Likewise, it may be eaten by several different levels above. So it's this interconnected mesh. It's a web where they are sort of all interconnected, and it is complex. And you're going to see some examples of that. Here's two. Notice the crisscrossing. Notice that, say, in this top one, there's an owl here with multiple arrows going to it, because an owl isn't just going to eat one type of animal, it's going to eat several. Likewise, this deer, there's several arrows going to it. It's going to eat some leaves from a shrub. It's going to maybe eat some leaves from a low tree. There's lots of different roles that these animals can play. There usually is some top predator, some top consumer. Notice that when you get to the owl, or when you get to this hawk-looking thing here, there's no arrow above. So there is a top predator, with one exception. Down here, it does a little bit better job of showing. I like this picture a little bit more. You have all of these arrows that always end at bacteria. No matter what the living thing is, it's eaten by bacteria. And that's something to keep in mind. The bacteria, the decomposers, the fungi, they're the end of the line, and they recycle the nutrients back so that they can be used again by the primary, or sorry, by the producer. Looking at trophic levels, here are some of the words that we've been using. The producer is the plant. The primary consumer is the herbivore. The secondary consumer is the carnivore. There's a tertiary consumer, which is, of course, a carnivore as well. An omnivore would be one that could be both a primary consumer and a higher order consumer at the same time. You have detritivores and scavengers. Detritivores and scavengers, of course, eat different dead animals, and that are not necessarily decomposers. And again, those two words often get confused. They're similar, but not necessarily synonymous. Detritivores have a role in decomposition, but decomposers strictly break down into simpler macromolecules. They're not necessarily just eating for the meat necessarily, the meat on a dead organism. Here's another look at energy flow, and this is particularly important because of heat. This shows the food chain where energy is really detailed. So you start with solar energy, and a lot of it finds its way in to the plants via photosynthesis. but some is lost in the process. In the process of going from the first trophic level, the producer, to the secondary trophic level, which are the primary consumers, that can get a little confusing, so you want to watch out for that. We have a primary consumer is at the second trophic level, so you have like a level 1 and a level 2, and it's the same thing. So kind of watch out for that, because the terminology can get a little mixed up. But notice that every time heat is lost, heat is lost, heat is lost. Some energy makes it, but there's always some inefficiency. In every process, there's going to be inefficiency. Second law of thermodynamics is alive and well in these ecosystems. Here's another example of a food web. Notice how many trophic levels before we can often get up to humans. If humans are eating whales, which does happen, maybe not killer whales, but if humans do eat certain types of whales, you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 different trophic levels. You could maybe even get to 8 here going this way. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 trophic levels. So the energy efficiency, so when you eat a shark, think about all of the energy efficiency lost had you just decided to eat something lower on the food chain as a substitute. Looking at these pyramids, the general rule here is 90%. Going from any trophic level up, 90% of the energy is lost, and you're left with only 10% remaining. So ecological efficiency is a big piece. So notice here at the bottom, the producers generate, say, 10,000 kilocalories of energy. Now, given heat loss, the amount of energy that transfers to the primary consumers that's stored in the biomass of those consumers is only 1,000. So you already had a 90% loss. You went from 10,000 to 1,000. Then from there, off to the third trophic level, you end up with 100. And then finally down to 10. This is one of the reasons why food webs don't often have 5, 6, 7 trophic levels. Because those animals, it's just hard to support organisms that are that high up, because it takes so much inefficiency to get there. Decomposers, of course, are always a part of the process, breaking down, and that process also loses heat. Notice the pyramid of biomass. So this is a pyramid of energy. This is a pyramid of biomass in the middle. And this pyramid shows, it's sort of a visual representation of how much mass is necessary to support the next level. So to support this tertiary level up here, these humans, look at the mass of phytoplankton that's necessary to support one human. And it's just graphic. This isn't linear, or this isn't quantitative at all in its representation. But you can see the base of the pyramid is significantly more wide and more broad than at the top. So it takes a lot of producers to support those higher levels. And finally, we're looking at primary productivity, which is looking at this unit. It's how much energy is produced per square meter per year. And this is a pretty important piece of the class, because certain ecosystems are more productive. And you can see which ones are very, very productive in terrestrial ecosystems, swamps and marshes. Those are wetlands. Tropical rainforests, also very, very productive. Looking in aquatic ecosystems, an estuary, very productive. Now an estuary, a swamp and a marsh, those are wetlands. Wetlands tend to be on the coast, somewhere near coastal areas, and that's where most humans want to live. So again, we're dealing with a situation where the most productive areas are where humans want to be. So the most productive areas are often disappearing. And that's, if you cut out your base of the pyramid from the previous slide, if you cut out your base, it's going to be an issue getting out to the top. Likewise, you can see that there are tropical rainforests and temperate rainforests pretty high. Tropical rainforests are often in developing regions, and so you have an issue there with developing countries harvesting resources for their own survival, but that depletes them. So we're losing a lot of primary productivity as the tropical rainforests disappear. So those are tremendous resources for putting energy into the system. When those disappear, if they do, we're going to be relying on areas that are much less able to support a large pyramid because they're just not that productive. They just don't pump out as many kilocalories per meter squared per year. That's the end of this chapter, at least the ecosystem portion. What's coming up next is biogeochemical cycles, and we're going to be working on that in class together. So again, some of the components that we talked about were what are the pieces of an ecosystem, what are some of the labels for those pieces in an ecosystem, and how does energy flow in an ecosystem.